Hello everyone and welcome to our presentation on the quantitative results chapter. Just before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to present this information in case you're interested in additional support outside of this webinar. So we do provide assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you do need additional help, more one-on-one help outside of this webinar, you can feel free to use the information that you see here to contact us, and we can let you know what types of assistance that we're able to provide. And just to give an overview of what we're going to be covering today, so this presentation is on the quantitative results chapter. So we'll only be talking about aspects of quantitative results today. We won't be covering qualitative results. We do have other webinars that are specifically geared towards qualitative. So if you're interested in those, I'd direct you to those webinars. And first, we're just going to talk about the purpose and the importance of the results chapter to the dissertation. And then we'll talk about the different components that are required for the results chapter. This includes the introduction, information about data collection and preparation, the descriptive statistics, assumptions testing, analyses of the research questions. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you do have a question, you can enter that into the question section. And at the end of the presentation, any questions that aren't answered over the course of the presentation, I'll do my best to answer your questions then. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the results chapter. So the results chapter is designed to present the data and the analyses that you conducted to answer the research questions and hypotheses that you set out in your study. So the previous chapters of the dissertation, so the introduction, literature review, and methodology chapters, are designed to establish why you're conducting your research and how you're conducting your research. When you get to the results chapter, it's finally time to start talking about what you actually did. So you have conducted your research and you have your data, and now it's time to analyze your data and actually get the answers to the research questions that you established earlier in your paper. And so in the results chapter, you should have findings that provide an answer for each research question and hypothesis that you laid out in your study. So if you had 5 research questions, by the end of your results chapter, you should have an answer to each of those 5 research questions. And you should have clear statements that state the answers to those research questions, or statements to address each of the hypotheses you laid out in your study. So there should be clear answers to those questions stated in the results chapter. But you want to save further interpretation and discussion of those results for the discussion chapter. So the results chapter is mainly just the results of the analyses that you'll use to arrive at answers to the research questions and hypotheses. But then any discussion beyond that, like talking about how it relates to the literature or the theory or the implications of that, that gets saved for the discussion chapter. And while it's important to note that we will be covering the sections of the results chapter that are typical based on our experience with many different schools, it is important that you check your school or degree program's specific guidelines to make sure that you include the information that is required. So different schools will have different requirements. Some schools may have more or different sections than what we talk about today. Some schools may want things organized a little bit differently than how we present it today. So you do want to make sure that if your school or degree program provides you guidelines for the results chapter, that you defer to those. And like most chapters of the dissertation, the results chapter, will begin with an introduction where you reorient your reader to the purpose of the study and the research questions. So you can start by just restating your purpose or your problem statement. This can either be a verbatim restatement or it can be an abbreviated version of your problem or purpose statement. You'll also want to restate your research questions and hypotheses, and these should be stated verbatim. So every time the research questions and hypotheses appear in your paper, they should be stated the exact same way and have the exact same wording every time. And then after you provide that information, you can give just a very brief outline of the contents of the results chapter. And this can be as simple as just listing out the different section headings that will appear in the chapter. And the first thing you'll want to talk about in the results chapter is information about your data collection and preparation. So in this section, you'll want to summarize the data collection procedures that you actually conducted, and importantly, note any changes from the procedures that you originally proposed. So it is possible that between your proposal stage and when you actually do your study and collect your data, that some things can change. So maybe, in your proposal, you propose to do some things in your data collection that you ended up having to change by the time you actually went to do your study and collect your data. So maybe you didn't get the maybe you weren't able to recruit participants in the exact way that you proposed, like you had to change your recruitment method. Or maybe you weren't able to use or didn't have available a specific measurement that you proposed for one of your variables, and you had to use something else to measure that variable, or maybe you had to drop a variable. So, for whatever reason, your data collection procedures may have changed from what you actually ended up doing from what you originally proposed, and that should be noted in some way. So some schools may want you to actually go back to your methodology chapter and update that and change it to reflect what you actually did. Other schools may want you to keep your originally proposed methodology intact and instead in the results chapter describe and justify any changes that you made to the data collection process. So whichever way your school wants you to do it, you do need to make sure that you describe any changes that you made from what you originally proposed. And in terms of describing the data collection, you'll want to discuss the response rate and any attrition in your study. So for instance, if you're doing something like a simple survey study, then you'll want information about how many total responses or how many total surveys did you get back. And then you want to talk about if you had to remove or exclude any of those responses. So there may be a variety of reasons why you may need to remove or exclude participants. So maybe the participants weren't eligible, like they didn't, you had screening questions and they didn't meet all of the eligibility criteria based on their answers to the screening questions. Or maybe they didn't agree to the consent form. Maybe they didn't complete the whole survey, and in your methodology you specified that you would only include participants that completed the entire survey. So you might have to exclude people for missing data, for instance. So you'll want to talk about all of that and say, if you had to exclude any participants, for what reasons did you have to exclude participants, and how many did you have to exclude for those reasons? After you discuss all that, you'll want to state what your final total sample size is after all of those exclusions. And then it may be necessary to conduct a post hoc power analysis if your target sample size was not met after all is said and done. So it's likely in your methodology chapter that you conducted something like a power analysis to determine the sample size that you need for your study. If your final sample size did not meet that target sample size, then some schools and committees may want you to do a post hoc power analysis to see what the power was of your study with the sample size that you obtained. In this section, you may also discuss preliminary data preparation steps. So this can involve things like checking the data for accuracy, especially if you did like an in-person paper and pencil survey and you had to enter the data manually into an electronic format. You want to make sure that you check that data entry to make sure it was done correctly and accurately. You'll want to talk about handling missing data. So you may have excluded some participants who were missing some data, but maybe you still included some participants who are missing some data. If so, then you'll need to explain how you're handling any missing values for participants that you retained for your analysis. So, did you do some kind of like a mean replacement, or did you do an imputation to replace the missing values? You'll want to describe how you're going to be dealing with the missing data, or how you handled any remaining missing data. And this could also include things like checking for outliers. It can also include things like any coding or recoding of the data that you have to do. So for instance, if you're using a survey instrument, like maybe a 10-item instrument that measures self-efficacy, do those responses need any special coding? For instance, do they need any reverse coding for negatively worded items? Is there any special process that you have to follow to compute scores for those variables? You'll want to describe all of those steps in this section. So now let's take a look at some examples of what information in this section might look like. So here we start off by saying what our initial number of responses were. So we say we had this many total survey responses. And then we say that we excluded participants who didn't complete a large section of the survey, and then say what our sample size was after we excluded those participants. And then we state how we're going to handle the missing data, or any missing data that remained with the participants that we ended up including in the final sample. Here's another example with a couple more details. So we start by saying when the data collection took place. Again, we say how many total participants accessed the survey. And then we talk about different exclusions that we had to apply. So some participants didn't agree to the informed consent. Some participants had too much missing data. Some participants didn't meet our inclusion criteria. And then here at the very end, again, we state what our final total sample size was after all of those exclusions. And then here's an example of how you might write up information on a post hoc power analysis. So here we state that we conducted the post hoc power analysis. We state what statistical analyses we conducted the post hoc power analysis for, in this case, a t-test and a regression. And we state what our observed power was for each of these analyses, given the sample sizes that we obtained. So after you describe all of the data collection and preparation procedures, you can get into your descriptive statistics. So in this section, you want to present descriptive statistics for all of the variables in your study. So whether they're just general demographic variables or the variables of interest, which would be the variables that are listed in your research questions and hypotheses. So you can conduct descriptive statistics such as frequencies and percentages for categorical variables. So examples of categorical variables would be things like gender and ethnicity. And then you can compute things like means and standard deviations for continuous variables. So a continuous variable would be something like someone's age in years or grade point average. If possible, you may want to compare the demographic characteristics of your sample to the population. So for instance, if you have information about the gender breakdown in your population of interest, you may want to compare that to the proportions of men and women in your study to see if it was similar to the population or not. And then if you have survey instruments which reliability is applicable, you may want to present Cronbach's alpha reliability coefficients for those survey instruments. Here's some examples of how you might present some descriptive statistics. So here we just have a little bit of text to describe some categorical demographic characteristics in our sample, as well as a table showing the frequencies and the percentages for these different demographic variables. One thing that's important to note is that in the results chapter, when you have tables or figures as well for information, you want to make sure that you always reference your tables and figures in the text. So we see here in the text, we specifically refer to table 1. And we also want to make sure that when you refer to a table in the text, that table appears in close proximity to where you first reference it in the text. So you don't want to mention table 1 and then table 1 doesn't appear until like 5 pages later. Similarly, you don't want to present table 1 and then don't mention it in the text at all until 5 pages later. So when you first mention the table, it should appear ideally right after the paragraph in which you first mention it. And here's another example of a table. This time it's a table showing descriptive statistics for continuous variables. So here we have means and standard deviations, as well as minimum and maximum values for our continuous variables. And then here's an example of how you might present results for Cronbach's alpha reliability coefficients. So we have a table here for each subscale that we used in our study, the number of items in that scale, and the alpha coefficient associated with that scale to indicate reliability. And once you're done with all of your descriptive statistics, it's time to start getting into the analyses for your research questions. But each analysis that you do will likely have certain statistical assumptions that need to be checked so that we can trust the results of those analyses. And so this is what we refer to as assumptions testing. And so you may have a section in your results where you talk specifically about the assumptions testing. And in this section, you'll want to list and discuss the required assumptions tests for each analysis that you conduct. So if you have, for instance, 5 research questions and you have 5 different analyses to answer those research questions, each of those analyses will have certain assumptions that need to be met and tested. So you'll want to describe the assumptions required for each analysis. And again, this can be in its own dedicated section, or you can present the assumptions testing alongside each analysis that you're doing. And for the assumptions testing, you will want to state how each assumption is tested. So for instance, if you're doing something like a t-test or an analysis of variance, you may need to test the assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance. And so if you're testing those two assumptions, then how are you going to test them? So how are you going to test the assumption of normality, for instance? Are you going to use something like a Shapiro-Wilk test, or are you going to do a visual test like a histogram or a PP plot? Or are you going to look at things like skewness and kurtosis values? Or are you going to use a combination of those methods to assess normality? So you want to say how you're testing each assumption. You'll want to say what the result of each assumptions test is. So you'll want to present the result of that test, make an interpretation of that test, and state whether the assumption appeared to be met or not. So if you're doing a test for normality, whichever method you choose, whether it's a Shapiro-Wilk test or a histogram or skewness and kurtosis values, you'll want to interpret those statistics and say, based on those statistics or those assumptions tests, does normality appear to be met, or was normality not met? And then if the assumption is not met, you want to describe any action that you took to account for the fact that the assumption wasn't met. So if you run your assumptions tests and you find that the assumption of normality is violated, then what are you going to do about that? So are you going to do some kind of transformation on your data so that the data follows a normal distribution? Or are you going to do an alternative test, like a non-parametric test, which doesn't require the normality assumption? So you want to make sure that you describe how you addressed any assumptions that were not met as a result of your assumptions testing. And again, this needs to be done for each analysis that you conduct in your study. So here's some examples of what the assumptions testing might look like. So in this case, we are testing normality using a normal PP plot. And so we just have some narrative here to say how we're testing normality. So we're testing it by looking at this normal PP plot. And we make an interpretation of that plot saying that the data did not significantly deviate from the normal line. And we state that the assumption of normality was met. Now, here's an example of some more descriptions of assumptions testing. And here we see an example where one of our assumptions was not met. So we say here that we are testing for outliers. And we state that we did find an observation that was an outlier. And then we say that we excluded this observation from our analysis. So we say what we did in response to that outlier being detected. And so after you've described your assumptions and ensured that all of your assumptions are tested, then you can finally get into the actual results of the analyses for each of the research questions. So you'll want to organize this section by your research question and hypothesis. So you maybe even have subsections for each research question. And you want to follow in order of your research questions if possible. So if you have 5 research questions, then you just want to list out your analyses and the results in order for research questions 1 through 5. You don't really want to go in some different order, like start with research question 2 and then jump to research question 4 and then go back to research question 1. You want to present your results in a logical order. And like your data collection procedures, if you had to change any of your proposed data analysis procedures from what you originally proposed in your methodology chapter, you will want to describe or note and justify those changes in your results. So much like your data collection procedures, or if your data collection procedures changed at all, it's also possible that the analysis plan could have changed. So if anything changed about your study that would affect the type of analysis that you're able to do, then your analysis plan would change. And so you would have to talk about those changes here. For each analysis that you're doing, you want to clearly identify the variables that are used in the analysis. So for something like a t-test or an ANOVA, you want to identify your independent and dependent variables for the analysis. If you're doing more of a correlational analysis, like a regression, you want to identify your predictor variables and your criterion variables, or any covariate or control variables that you're including in the analysis. And in terms of the results for each analysis, you want to report the appropriate statistics associated with the specific test that you're doing. So usually include p-values, measures of effect size, confidence intervals, the test statistics, so like the t statistic for a t-test, the f statistic for an ANOVA. And if your analysis requires any post hoc testing, you want to report the results of that. So if you're doing an ANOVA, for instance, and your ANOVA was significant, which indicates that there are differences among the groups that you're comparing, you may need to do post hoc comparisons to see exactly which groups were different from each other. So you'd want to include those results as well. And very importantly, you want to include a clear statement that answers each research question hypothesis based on the results of the analysis. So after you present the results, the statistical results for each test, you then want to just make a very clear, simple statement that addresses the research question or hypothesis. And if your hypotheses are in the null and alternative format, you would usually do this by making a statement about the null hypothesis. So stating that the null hypothesis was rejected if your results were statistically significant, or stating that the null hypothesis was not rejected if your results were not statistically significant. So now let's take a look at some examples of how you might present the results for a couple of different analyses. So in this first example, we'll show how you might write up the results for an independent samples t-test. So we start by stating what analysis we're conducting. So we're saying we're conducting a t-test. We state our independent and dependent variables, and we present the results of our t-test. In this case, our t-test isn't significant because our p-value here is greater than 0.05. But for our t-test, we present, in addition to the p-value here, our t statistic with the degrees of freedom for the test in parentheses, and this value for d here, which is Cohen's d, is the measure of effect size. And we state that because the test was not significant, there were no differences between the groups, and we make our statement about the null hypothesis, saying that the null hypothesis was not rejected. And if there are any additional statistics that you can present in a table, like for instance, for a t-test, you might want to present the means for each of the groups that you're comparing. You might present those statistics in a table alongside those results. Here's another example for a t-test. At this time, we have an example where the t-test was significant. So again, we say that we're conducting the t-test. We state our independent and dependent variables. Again, we present the results of our t-test, but this time it is significant because our p-value is less than 0.05. And we make a statement about our hypothesis. Because it was significant, we can say that our null hypothesis was rejected. And again, we have a table presenting the means for the groups that we are comparing. Now, here's an example of how you might write up an analysis of variance, or an ANOVA. Again, we state that we are conducting the ANOVA. We state our independent and dependent variables. And then we present the results for the F-test for the ANOVA. So we have our F statistic here. And for an F-test, we also have degrees of freedom in parentheses, but for an F-test, there are always 2 degrees of freedom. The first degrees of freedom is the numerator degrees of freedom, and then the second number is the denominator or error degrees of freedom. And then we have our p-value, which here is greater than 0.05, so that is not significant. Because it's not significant, again, we have our statement here saying that the null hypothesis was not rejected. And again, you might have a table just showing the means of the groups that you're comparing in that ANOVA. Now here is what results for a simple correlation analysis might look like. And so in this write-up here, we actually first restate the research question. We say that we're conducting Pearson correlations to see the relationships between the variables. And we state our variables here. And then we present the statistics for our correlation coefficients. So our R value, the correlation coefficient, as well as the P value for those correlations. And we do have significant correlations here with p-values less than 0.05. So can say that there are significant correlations here. And so we would reject our null hypothesis, which we state here at the end. And you may also have, if you have a lot of correlations, you may have a table showing the correlation coefficients in your study. And now here's how you might write up the results for a regression analysis. So you may start with the results for the overall regression model, which would be an F-test. So this would be similar to the ANOVA, where you present your F statistic and the p-value. And you may also present the R squared, which is the percent of variance explained. And we see our p-value for our regression here is less than 0.05, so that is significant. So we have a statement where we say we reject our null hypothesis. And then if you have a significant regression, you may want to present the individual regression coefficients to see which of your predictors were significant. So you might present those in a table like this, where you present all of your different predictors. And you might present your B value, which is the unstandardized regression coefficient, the standard error, the beta, which is the standardized regression coefficient, the t value for the significance test, the actual significance value for the individual predictor. You might also report variance inflation factors, or the VIF here. And in your narrative, you may want to describe any predictors that were significant. So in this case, in our regression model here, we see that sex is a significant predictor because the p-value for this regression coefficient is less than 0.05. And so we make a determination about that predictor. So we say it's significant, and we know it's a positive predictor because our regression coefficient is positive. And we just write an interpretation for that regression coefficient. And at the end of the results chapter, so once you have presented the results and have an answer to each of your research questions, you may want to have a summary section where you summarize the contents of the chapter, or maybe just summarize the findings for the research questions. So in the summary, I usually want to restate the answer to each research question or hypothesis. So again, for each hypothesis, saying if the null hypothesis was rejected or not rejected. And then you can provide just a transition to your discussion chapter. Okay, so that brings us to the end of a presentation on the contents of the quantitative results chapter. Again, if you're interested in additional support, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the additional support that we can provide. And now I'll open things up to questions. So if you do have questions, you can feel free to enter those into the questions section now, and I'll do my best to answer your questions and just see what questions that we have so far. And one question is, how do you know that the null hypothesis was not rejected? So you make determinations about the null hypothesis based on the p-value or the significance value of your test. So if we go back to, for instance, our regression example here, and we look at the results of our test, we look at our p-value, which is the, it's also known as the significance value. And we look at this value and we see if it is either above or below the significance cutoff that we're using in the study. And typically in the social sciences, the significance cutoff would be 0.05. So in this case, we see that this p-value is less than 0.05, and that would indicate that the result is significant. And if the result is significant, then we would reject the null hypothesis. If this p-value is greater than 0.05, then we would not reject the null hypothesis. So we would fail to reject the null hypothesis in that case. And then another question was, is it okay to list the table number at the end? So if you want to, at the end of a paragraph, say, or reference the table at the end of a paragraph instead of the beginning, you can do that. You just want to always make sure that the first time that you mention the table in the text, that table appears near where you mention it. So it should be basically right after the paragraph where you mention the table. As long as those are in close proximity to each other, the table itself and the very first instance where you mention the table, then you should be fine. So another question is, can we use the method of interpolation to fill missing data in qualitative studies? I don't know if you mean quantitative studies there. In qualitative, you wouldn't really deal with missing data in a statistical way, and this presentation is not focused on qualitative analysis. But if you're talking about quantitative, then yes, there are different ways that you can replace missing data. There are many different methods for doing so. So there are very basic methods like mean replacement. So you can just, replace a missing value with, the mean of the sample, for instance. It's a very basic method. There are much more advanced methods such as imputation. So there's multiple imputation, for instance, which basically runs your variables through a regression to try to predict what the missing values would have been based on the other values that the participants provided. And you may do this multiple times, hence the name multiple imputation, and see if you get similar results across those different iterations or imputations. So those are different methods of varying complexity that you could potentially use to replace missing data. So another question is, or the popular hypothesis tests used in quantitative research? That's going to depend on, if you mean the types of statistical analysis, then that's going to depend on your specific research questions. And we do have other webinars dedicated to determining the appropriate analysis based on your research questions and hypotheses. So if you want more information or guidance on that topic, I'd direct you to those webinars. But essentially, the short answer is that the type of test that you do depends on the research question that you're trying to answer. Like, for instance, if your research question involves comparing two groups like men and women on a certain variable, then you might do something like a t-test. Or if your research question is about a relationship between two variables, you might do a correlation. So another question is, what is the best way to determine what type of assumptions tests are to be used? So again, that's going to be specific to the analysis, and there will be different resources that will suggest what assumptions tests should be conducted for certain analyses. Like, for instance, if you're doing a t-test, people will commonly test the assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance. Some references may suggest testing additional assumptions, or may list additional assumptions. It kind of depends on what statistical reference you're using, but each statistical test will have different assumptions associated with it, and those assumptions will be tested in different ways. Normality has a lot of different ways that you can test it, and there are different statistical tests will have different tests that are more appropriate than others. Like, for instance, for normality, if you're doing normality for a t-test, you're testing the normality of your dependent variable. If you're doing something like a regression, you should actually be testing the normality of the residuals, because that is what the regression assumes. So it's going to depend on the specific analysis that you're doing in order to determine what assumptions tests are appropriate or what assumptions need to be met. It will depend on the specific analysis. And another question is, when you do regression testing? So regression is used when you are trying to predict a variable from a set of predictors, or see the relationship between multiple variables in a single outcome variable. So if we go back to our regression example, we have a regression here, and what we're predicting, which we list in our table title up here, is we're predicting prevention behavior score. And we're trying to predict that score based on a number of different variables that include age, sex, income, race. So a bunch of different demographic characteristics, as well as some other variables down here like family support and self-efficacy. So you'd use a regression if you have a lot of predictors or variables that you want to see if those are related to or can predict the values of a certain variable. And again, we have other webinars that are dedicated specifically to what types of analyses you should do based on your research questions. And I think we also have some webinars that are specific to regression. So if you have more questions specifically about regression, I would direct you to those webinars. Okay, so if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to enter those into the question section now. I'll give another minute or so for any additional questions. So for the question about how we can access the other webinars, I think in the chat posted earlier was a link to the webinar archive. I will go ahead and repost it here. But you can go to our resources and our webinar archive to see our past webinars. And you can also go to our list of upcoming webinars to see what other topics we're going to be doing in the future. Okay, it doesn't look like any additional questions are coming in, so I'll go ahead and end the presentation there for today. So thanks everyone for attending. And again, if you are interested in more one-on-one support outside of the webinars that we offer, then you can contact us using the information on the screen here to learn more about the types of assistance that we can provide. Again, thanks everyone for attending today. I hope everyone found this presentation useful, and I hope everyone has a great day.